I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about computational and in vitro studies of blast-induced blood-brain barrier disruption. I'm going to tell you what that means in a little bit. Okay, so first, an outline of my talk. First, I'm going to give you a little bit of the motivation. Why do we want to study this? Then I'm going to go and mention a couple of the in vitro studies that there were actually experimental studies made by some collaborators that we have at the Better Administration Hospital. Then I'm going to talk you how that we translate that into computational studies. And I'm going to mention a bit of a discussion about these results and how do they relate to the experimental context. And if I have some time, I'm going to talk to you about a couple of extensions. Now, this is work done in collaboration with Randy and David Cook, along with a whole team of experimentalists from the Better Administration Hospital, as I mentioned. And yeah, I'll be mentioning them later on the acknowledgements. Okay, so if I'm going to be talking about blast-induced blood-brain barrier disruption, I should first tell you what is the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so the blood-brain barrier is a highly selective permeability barrier, and it's formed around the microvessels of the brain, and around the blood vessels of the brain, and it's formed with endothelial cells that are joined together by tight junctions. So this is a really important membrane because it keeps neurotoxins in the blood away from our brain and keep our brain healthy. It also allows the passage of molecules that are important for neural function. Some characteristic that tells you about the integrity of the membrane is the electrical resistivity that it has. So the electrical resistivity is some way to measure the integrity of this barrier. Now, why do we care about blood-brain barrier disruption? Well, we care about this because it is related with a traumatic brain injury, as I'm going to show you. And traumatic brain injury is a leading cause of death and disability of people under the age of 45 years worldwide. And it is the leading cause of death and disability for people under the age of 45 in the US. So it affects high-contact athletes. This could be from football players, soccer players, of course, boxers, and some other disciplines. People in car and bike accidents, civilians close to war regions, like we see in this image, that is a bombing in a civilian region, and also from war veterans. So our collaborators at the Better Administration Hospital, they're actually studying TBI in war veterans. The war veterans that they see, they're actually exposed between 50 and 100 mild blast waves when they come back. And something that I really want to emphasize is that the average enlistment age is between 20 and 21. So sometimes when we think about the word veteran, we tend to think about older people, but the truth is that these are mostly kids. And 18% of these come back with a symptomatic mild traumatic brain injury. Now, what do I mean by mild? I mean that they're exposed to many mild blasts, and that it's really hard to detect their damage by conventional means. So no brain damage is diagnosed by standard methods. Now, what people have found is that repetitive exposures to shock in the head can set in motion some pathogenic process that years later, and it can be like a long time, 10 years, 20 years, emerges some kind of neurodegenerative disorder. And this can be very similar, for instance, to Alzheimer, Parkinson, or other type of dementias. Now, what we really care, why do we care about this is because we want to know what are the biological mechanisms that generate this mild traumatic brain injury. So there are several hypotheses. Some of them are, for instance, damage to astrocyte cells. The astrocyte cells are like the parents of your brain. They're always like taking care that like your neurons have the nutrients that they need. They're like making sure that everything is working out fine. So if you damage the cells, eventually it will reflect in damage in your brain. The other possibility is brain cells damage directly, of course. And there's a bunch of hypotheses that people do. So the one that we're going to actually concentrate is in the one that talks about changes in blood-brain barrier diffusion or permeability. So this is why we care about blood-brain barrier disruption. Now the question comes to us how to study the blast-induced blood-brain barrier disruption. And this is actually a question more that the experimentalists had to answer. So one possibility is try to do in vivo experiments. The problem with in vivo experiments is that they usually lack functional and anatomical precision to relate blast with damage. And this is because it's really hard to set an in vivo experiment where you have a preferred orientation of the cell layer with the direction of the shock. So another possibility, of course, is doing a simplified in vitro experiment. So what they're doing at the BI hospital, they grow mouse brain-derived endothelial cells in a nylon membrane, which is this one over here. They put it in this a small transwell, and it forms a monolayer here that actually forms tight junctions and can actually mimic the blood-brain barrier. Then this sample is placed inside this cylindrical transwell, and here we have a cartoon that actually shows it in a quite simple way. When this is closed, then this is actually filled with an aqueous solution inside, and this is how the sample is prepared. Now, what happens later is they actually have a shock tube in the veterans at the BA hospital. So this is a picture of the shock tube that they have in their lab. The shock is produced on this side of the shock tube. It travels in this direction, and then the sample is placed in this container over here. And the back part that you see is only an attenuator. Okay, so now we can think of a cartoon of the experiment to make it like a bit more visually understandable. So if we see a cylindrical cross-section inside the shock tube, which is this one, we'll have a shock wave front coming from this side, and then it will eventually hit our transwell with the sample cells inside. Okay? As we can see, it's filled with an aqueous solution, so I just paint that in blue so it's clear. So the advantage of this setup is that now we have a well-defined orientation with respect to the shock. Okay, so what did the experimentalists found about doing this experiment? So for instance, they studied the permeability of the membrane, and as they increased the intensity of the shock, the permeability of the membrane was increased as well. They also measured the transendothelial electrical resistance, and as you can see, it diminished as well with shock intensity. One more study that they performed was they study a protein that is called CO1 that is associated with the scaffolding of the tight junction. So it tells you how, in some sense, how well the tight junction is doing in these cells. So for instance, here is an image of the cells before the blast, and here an image after the blast, 24 hours after the blast. So if we see at one of the points here, and one of the points here, well, in general in the picture you can see that there's a huge difference in how this protein is distributed, right? Here it's all over the place, and here it's actually well distributed in the junctions. And this other one is the same picture, it's just tilted a little bit to show better how the tight protein is a little bit of a mess down here. Now this is of course not completely unexpected. If you throw a shock wave to something, probably things are gonna get a little bit messed up. But what we really wanna know is what are more specific damage mechanisms in the cells. The big problem. Oops. The problem is that it's very difficult to obtain accurate measurements of the stress exerted where the cells are, at least at an experimental level. So if we were able to know these stresses, we will be able to relate better what could be some specific damage mechanisms that relate with these experimental outcomes. Okay, so then to do the computational model, we're going to start again. We have here the cartoon of the experiment, so we don't forget about it. And we're going to do 3 experiments. The first experiment is just going to be a one-dimensional experiment. Why do we care about the one-dimensional experiment? Well, when the shock comes here, it's going to hit first the transwell, and then the shock is going to travel through the transwell in the plastic, and then it's going to go into the water. So we want to know what happens in this triple interface here, and what is a good way to model it. So that's why we're going to study the one-dimensional problem first. Then we're going to jump to the number 2 and number 3 that I'll explain later on. Okay, so we want to model a a one-dimensional interface problem where we have air, plastic, and water. We need a model that can model acoustic pressure, that allows the formation of shocks. And we don't really care about the viscosity since we're modeling the acoustic pressure. And we want to model sharp interfaces. So one possibility is going to be compressible Euler equations. It's written in the conservation form. And of course, we're going to need an equation of state to close the system. Okay, so here we have density. This is the U is velocity, E is the energy, but we also have the pressure, right? So we are going to need an additional equation to close the system. And this equation of state is basically going to be the Taman equation of state, which is just an ideal gas plus a stiffening term. So this term can be interpreted basically as modeling an ideal gas at a very high pressure. So it helps us model basically an almost incompressible fluid. Now, we also need to input the initial shock into the model. So if we see this picture here, the black line is the shock wave as measured in the experiment in the shock tube. So we want to, in some sense, put this as an initial condition into our model. So how we do it, we basically do an approximation of this shock, and we write as a function of time, and then we implement it in the left boundary condition of the problem. So that way we can simulate a shock coming from the far field in the left. Now, how to model the interfaces? Well, we're going to have 3 materials, so we're going to have 3 sets of parameters. The area, we're just going to model it as an ideal gas. There are these 2 parameters. And then we're going to model this plastic and water from these parameters from the literature. And something to be noted that is going to be very relevant to the model is that these P infinity parameters are in gigapascals. So that's like 9 orders of magnitude bigger than in the ideal gas. And this is actually going to be a very important problem in our modeling situation. Okay, so I'm going to go a little bit more into detail without going too much into detail. So these Euler equations are just a conservation law with Q equals density, momentum, and energy. And we're going to solve this using high-resolution finite volume methods in their wave propagation form. So how we can think this method is if we think about a cell average, well, we discretize our space in cells. And then if we think about the cell average, we want to update the cell average at time Tn with the incoming waves from the left edge and the incoming waves from the right edge at time Tn plus 1. So how do we do that? So we're just going to use the Godunov method plus high resolution limiters. So the Godunov method basically tells you we're updating the cell average at time tn plus 1 with the contributions from the left edge, where S is just the speeds of the waves, and W is just the waves themselves. That's just going to be the jump across the actual characteristic. Then, of course, the contributions from the right edge in the same way. And we're going to also include the high resolution terms. Of course, when we include high resolution terms, you get oscillations because they are just validated for smooth data. So if we want to remove those oscillations, we have to introduce limiters, which basically what the limiter does is if we are close to a shock or a discontinuity, we're going to use lower resolution method, and if we're like in a smooth region, we're going to use the high resolution terms. Okay. Now, in order to be able to implement this, we need to calculate the speeds S and the waves W. So the way to do that, of course, is the key ingredient in finite volume methods. That is just the Riemann problem. So the Riemann problem is just the conservation law with a constant state on the left and a constant state in the right as an initial condition. So for instance, in the Euler equations, how does the solution of the Riemann problem looks like? So this is the x and t plane. On time 0, we only have two states, that is the left state and the right state. And then as time evolves, we're going to have three waves. The wave 1 could be a rarefaction wave or a shock wave. The wave 3 could be a shock or a rarefaction. And in the middle, we're going to have the contact discontinuity. So there are several ways that we can solve this Riemann problem on each cell interface to be able to implement it into the finite volume method. A possibility is the row solver. The problem with the row solver is that it usually takes an average state, calculates an average between the two states, and then uses that to calculate the waves. The problem is that as we have a huge jump in the parameter in the Taman equation of state, then it's not a good idea to do this average. It doesn't work. The method just goes unstable. Other possibilities are an exact solver and an HLC solver that are actually going to be a better options. HLC is just stands by Harten, Lax, and Van Leer contact solver. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's a huge jump in the parameters across the interface. And this brings instabilities with usual methods. So even when we use an exact solver or the HLC solver, the method is going to go unstable. So how do we fix it? So if we think about the Riemann solver as the approximate Riemann solver as in some way something similar to this picture, where we have the three waves and the four states in between, we're going to have an issue because the contact discontinuity, usually we expect it to be moving along with the interface. But our interface is fixed in here. So if we have a contact discontinuity that is moving along, then even if the contact discontinuity speed is really small, it can actually cause instabilities. So how do we fix it? We move this Riemann solver, the solution of the Riemann problem, we move it into a Lagrangian frame of reference. As we move it here, then the contact discontinuity will actually be 0. So we are going to have a perfect alignment between the contact discontinuity and the interface. And these are going to actually help us do remove the instabilities of the method. However, of course, we're making some kind of error. But as the contact discontinuity speed is actually really small, this error should not be very big. OK, so some of the things that we actually implemented was we actually developed an exact Riemann solver for the Euler equations with a Taman equation state with a jump in the parameters. This was important, first, because it's going to be a reference solution for our problem. And it's going to be useful for validation and verification of the algorithm. We developed an hybrid HLC and exact Riemann solver, which uses this Lagrangian transformation of the Riemann solver at the interfaces to remove the instabilities, and uses the HLC solver in air and the exact solver in water, since we actually want to be really precise in the calculations that we do in the water interface. All these algorithms were implemented into the CLOPAC 5 software. Okay, so this is a result of the one-dimensional air-plastic water interface. So what we can see here is as we have an incoming shock from the left, we can see that it bounces back and forth several times in the plastic interface. We also see there's a pressure increase when it crosses to the plastic interface. So the very important result from this first experiment is as we do as the plastic interface becomes thinner and thinner, these reflections going back and forth eventually are negligible in the ending result of the shock wave, because this little peak over here catches up with this one, and it will be exactly the same as if we didn't have plastic interface at all. So we did a whole study of this problem that is in these conference proceedings that we published. So the main result of this one-dimensional problem is that we can actually, if the plastic is thin enough, we can actually neglect it from our simulations. And this is going to be very important to be able to do the jump to the three-dimensional problem. It got stuck. Okay. So before jumping into a higher dimensional problem, we did a verification study for this problem. When we already got rid of the plastic interface, we did the X-T plane again, and we took the length of the transwell, the cylindrical transwell that we saw before, and we used a water interface in here, and air. So if we have a shock coming from the left as it reaches the first interface here, at point A, we can actually make this drawing where we can interpret this as a Riemann problem at point A. So the exact solution would be the Riemann solver with the Taman equation state that we use. And the numerical solution from our model is going to be a dashed line. Okay? So a time later, 6 microseconds later, we can see that the reflected waves across the interface actually match quite well between the numerical simulation and the exact Riemann solver. Now again, this wave over here is going to keep on traveling on the water until hitting point B. As it's about to hit point B, it will again look as another Riemann problem, or at least really close to another Riemann problem at this point. So we can again do compare it with an exact solver, and 6 microseconds afterwards at this point B, we can see that the reflected waves here match quite well again between the exact and our numerical simulation. And in here, you cannot see in this graph, but if we zoom in, there's still a reflected wave that we can see that it still matches quite well. These are all, by the way, these are all pressure plots. We also studied the convergence, so we just did like three different grids between 200, 400, and 800. And as we can see in the different regions, we can see that our method is actually converging to the exact solution as well. This is actually from this last time. So it has information from the 2 reflections in between the interface. Okay, so the next computational experiment is going to be number 2. So we're going to jump straight into 3 dimensions. And we are not going to model the endothelial cells because we just want to know what's the pressure in that region. So we're going to just model the cylindrical cross-section of the shock tube with a cylindrical water interface inside. As we already know, we can neglect the plastic. We can leave the plastic outside of the simulation and just like use water in a fixed interface. Okay, so how do we do a 3-dimensional model? Well, we can actually do a three-dimensional model that uses just 2D numerical methods. So as we have cylindrical symmetry, we can just do a two-dimensional grid where we put here the water interface as a rectangle. And as we spin this around this axis, we will recover the full three-dimensional cylinder. So we're going to model a three-dimensional wave propagation with just a two-dimensional numerical scheme. Okay. Now we're of course, gonna need different equations. So we write the three-dimensional Euler equations. We get rid of all the cylindrical symmetries. And then whatever doesn't look as the two-dimensional Euler equations, we just move it to the other side. And we get these source terms over here. And this is just two-dimensional Euler equations. So the problem that we have to solve now numerically is two-dimensional Euler equations plus. Okay, so to simulate these equations, we're again going to use the Taman equation of state to model the interface. In order to do a two-dimensional numerical method with second-order accuracy, we're going to include Transberg-Riemann solvers. And in order to solve for the source term, we're going to do a fractional step method. Yeah. Okay, so the Transberg-Riemann solver is also going to be a problem because of this big jump across the interfaces. So the usual way that we do the Transberg solvers, if we think about that left edge contribution that I told you about earlier, we can just write that as notation-wise, like this, right? So we have this contribution here, that is the blue wave. But of course, this wave in a two-dimensional problem, we can interpret that it's actually going to also travel in the upward direction and in the downward direction. So we can decompose it using row eigenvectors again. But as I told you before, the row eigenvectors are a bad idea because they use some kind of averaging. And when we have such a big jump across the interface, this averaging will not work. So what we did, we used an approximation with acoustics equations to derive these Transberg solvers. So then we just use the sound speed in this cell that is C3 and the sound speed at this cell that is C2 to calculate this contribution, the yellow one here, that is going to be this one. So anyway, with this one we can do the Transberg solvers and get like a second accurate method. Now for the fractional step method, we're going to do in the first half time step, we're going to solve the two-dimensional Euler equations without the source terms. And on the second half time step, we're just going to solve this ODE that is just basically the time derivative with the source terms. Now, this can normally be solved with any time integrator like Runge-Kutta or trapezoidal backward difference, whichever you can think. But it happens that this one is actually exact, so we can actually write the exact solutions for this solver. Okay, so what are the results when we do the simulation? So what I'm gonna show you here is gonna be these are gonna be pressure contours again. The square that you see inside is the water interface. The axis of revolution is gonna be the center one. So this is actually modeling 3D wave propagation. And down here, I'm going to be modeling a slice along the axis. Okay? So if we run the simulation, we're going to see something very quite interesting. So this line that I drew here, this is the vapor pressure. The vapor pressure of water at room temperature is 2,400 pascals, more or less. And what the vapor pressure means is the pressure at which water basically would become gas. So the fact that we have the pressure going here below the vapor pressure, it means that bubbles can form. And when bubbles can form, you can have a phenomenon that is called cavitation. And cavitation are just the formation of these bubbles. And then when they collapse, then they can form shock waves as well. that might damage, or they can also do jetting that can damage the surroundings. So for instance, in the propellers of submarines and of ships, it's very common to see damage along the metal propellers, and it's really impressive like how these little bubbles can produce so much damage. So this result tells us that cavitation might be something that is happening in this model. Now, something that is also particularly interesting is that if we go back a little bit, we see that this is the pressure profile at the slice of the simulation. If we compare this to a one-dimensional model, it will look something like this. You have the shock wave coming from the left to an air-water-air interface, and as it comes in, it just looks like this. We don't have this effect over here, and this effect over here is what eventually is going to cause the cavitation later on, or the possibility of a cavitation happening later on. So this tells that the geometry of the experiment itself is very relevant in what could be the damage mechanisms that you're seeing. And of course, it tells us as well that the geometry of the brain, or the geometry of whichever you are studying at the moment, might be very relevant to understand what is actually happening in the brain. Okay, so these are the 2D results. Well, the 2D axisymmetric results that are like three-dimensional. Gonna get stuck. Okay, so now we have we're going to have also like a third experiment. So what happens if we try to introduce an hydrophone? An hydrophone is just basically a microphone, but for water, of course. And it will measure in some the pressure where the endothelial cells would be if we run the experiment. So experimentally, if we want to do that, it might actually influence the experiment. So how can it influence? What happens if we actually put an hydrophone inside? So what we did a numeric computational experiment where we put the hydrophone inside and see how it actually affects the pressure inside the transwells. Since now we know that the geometry is so important in the model. So this is what we see now. So again, we have the same picture as before, but now we have this hydrophone in here. And when we have the shock, the incoming shock from the left, the fact that there is an hydrophone produces a very interesting effect. So if we put a gauge over here, in the previous experiment, we would see the pressure as a function of time would be this black line. And this black line actually goes below vapor pressure. But if we introduce the hydrophone, we would see the red line over here. And as we see, this red line doesn't actually go below vapor pressure. This tells you that just the fact that you're trying to measure the pressure at that point experimentally might actually influence what you're trying to see. So this is an important statement for how important are the numerical computations in conjunction with the experiment. Okay. Okay, so a summary of the results of the computational studies, along with this is just like a three-dimensional visualization of the previous experiment. Okay, so a summary of the results. The thin plastic interface is negligible. That was a result from the one-dimensional one. The geometry and the reflections inside the interface can actually be responsible for producing cavitation. Measuring devices can as well influence the results. You might actually affect the possibility of seeing cavitation or not. And something important that I think to mention is other geometries like the skull need to be further investigated in other models. Okay, so just try to drag it back to the experimental context. This computational approach allows us to measure the pressure profile at any point in the transworld without disrupting the experiment. It also gives a very high resolution signal that can allow us to identify in which regions cavitation might be an actual phenomena that is happening. It can, in general, aid experimentalists to understand how, if they want to introduce a measuring device, how could that actually influence the experiment that they're trying to understand. And in general, the results that we have suggest that cavitation could be a damage mechanism that might explain the mislocalization of the tight junction protein like CO1, the increase in the blood-brain barrier permeability, and the loss of the transendothelial electrical resistance. So with this would be the end of the main part. And I'm just going to go really fast and just show you some of the extensions that we're working on. So now it's the model is now working with adaptive mesh refinement. This is really useful because now we can run simulations really fast and be really accurate about like the pressure that we're measuring. We're also like moving it into a map grid. So as we need to have the interfaces fixed with the grid, we want to model like a circular interface or like spherical interface. We need to do a map grid. So for instance, here we're just mapping the rectangle into a sphere now, so we can do actually a spherical simulation now. This is basically how it would look with a spherical simulation, and the final comments, it would be the methods that we develop in this problem. It could be used for not only for TBI experiments, but it could probably be extended to other fields. And we're trying to make a point for this by doing a very reproducibility by doing the code is open source and it's available available in GitHub. And that would basically be all. I would like to acknowledge the whole experimental group from the VA Hospital at the University of Washington. And here are some references. Thanks. Yes.
You compare the acid symmetric results with the one thing. What about different?
It does change a little bit, but not as much as you would think. So there's some influence from the source terms, and we did compare it, but you still see the same phenomena. There's still it still goes below the vapor pressure into the
Related to what we can talk about concussions and stuff.
Yes, totally. So with a concussion. So the experimentalist group that we're working with TBI, they are mentioning all these issues, for instance, that the NFL is talking about. So there's a lot of research going on with this concussion, and this is one of the main hypotheses actually that the blood-brain barrier disruption, because they're seeing very similar patterns in people with Alzheimer and Parkinson to what they're seeing with people with a mild traumatic brain injury. That would be the case of football players, for instance.
Any more questions? Okay, thanks, speaker again.
Thanks.
So first of all, I think we should
Everybody for attending.
another great meeting. I've been to most of these meetings over the last 28 years or whatever now, and it's always a great experience. And it's always fun to see old friends, and I've met a lot of people at these meetings I've known for decades now. It's always good to meet people. It's great to be here. And one thing we always talk about is where should we do this in the future? And we had a discussion last year at the end, which I remember part of that discussion. At least I know that Malgo and Oregon State wanted to lock in 2017, the year after next. And I believe there was discussion of SFU maybe doing it next year. But is there anybody here still from SFU? Rick was here earlier. So definitely they're doing this next year. So we may be mistaken in that, but we will find. I know Jim Duplo also offered Washington State Tri-Cities campus. perhaps in conjunction with Pacific Northwest National Lab, where they were there a couple decades ago now. It would be nice to have it out
Not
there.
quite that long.
So, there are definitely possibilities for next year. There'll be some discussion, I'm sure, on the PNWNES mailing list. If other people are interested in hosting one of these, better lock it in now if you want 2019, 20, beyond. It's a very popular meeting, as you can see, and it's great that there's always meetings. Thanks again for organizing.